Trick or treat echoed through the old house on Mason Street. It was Halloween in America. Under normal circumstances, the Masons might have celebrated more, perhaps with more elaborate decorations featuring artistically carved pumpkins, spooky ghost garlands, and a few cardboard figures. But this Halloween, nothing happened. John didn't know exactly what he had done wrong. Perhaps he had pressured his wife Alice too much about wanting children. Yes, that was probably it. Alice had always loved children. She enjoyed looking after her grandcousin's kids, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for a baby of her own yet. In any case, Alice had been ignoring John for quite a while now. Sometimes she treated him as if he weren't there. John often became angry. Once, he had thrown a picture of him and her onto the floor so hard that the frame shattered into 1,000 little pieces. He remembered how she, completely frightened of him, had picked up the large shards with tears in her eyes. In that moment, his anger dissipated, leaving only bitter guilt and deepest compassion within him. He wanted to hug her, to comfort her, but she turned away from him and left the room. Since then, it hadn't gotten any better. She became increasingly colder toward him, no matter how often he apologized for his temper. But he loved her. He didn't want to leave her, and he only hoped that she still felt the same way about him. While all these thoughts ran through his head, he stared at the plastic bowl filled with sweets. It was probably bought from some cheap store, yet in this situation it had something fascinating about it. He snapped out of his trance only when Alice walked past him and turned toward the bowl. Her blonde hair smelled of coconut and was hidden under a slightly cheesy yet somehow charming witch's hat. He remained standing, but his attention was now on his girlfriend, whom he loved so much and yet despised at the moment for her coldness. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but there was no reaction. She brushed past him again, went to the door, and greeted the children. He followed her, watching as she distributed chocolate bars, candies, and other sweets to the little monsters. She had always been a patient person. Why could she be so kind to the children and not to him? The children moved on, continuing their tour through the neighborhood. Alice watched them for a short while longer, and John placed his hand on her shoulders. When she noticed this, she quickly turned around and stared at him, but neither of them said a word. John gazed for another moment into her sea-blue eyes before gently kissing her on her lips, which were painted with black lipstick. For a moment, it seemed as if warmth had caught up with them again, as if there had never been any argument. Then the doorbell rang again. "Trick or treat," came the muffled sound. She continued to stare at him for a moment. "You take care of the kids," said John again. She opened the door and was greeted by a little Frankenstein, 2 ghosts, and 3 witches. The 2 parents stood just a few meters away, talking about everyday parenting things, as John suspected. The next hour went quite well compared to the last few days. Alice and John watched a movie together. Nothing spectacular, just a typical Halloween film. But when the doorbell rang for the 5th time that evening, John noticed how empty the plastic bowl had become. He thought for a moment, stared at the end credits of the film, and finally decided to get up and fetch some more sweets. "I'm going shopping again," he called after wrapping a scarf around his neck. The days were autumnal. It was getting cooler in the evenings. It was now 7 p.m. There would surely be a few more children coming by. He was certain of that. As he left the house, he was first greeted by a cold wind. He wondered how parents could let their children run around outside in this weather, but probably the children's craving for sweets was simply too great to be held back. The supermarket was only a few streets away, so John decided to walk. Just as he was about to turn around to take Laker Street, he noticed something. It was actually nothing significant, just a disturbing idea. A shadow he thought he saw out of the corner of his eye. But when he looked again, the creature was gone, as if it had never been there. Irritated and believing it was pure imagination, he set off and walked down the streets. There was something eerie and uncanny about walking in the cold on the streets. He didn't encounter many children, only 2 smaller groups with maybe 3 little monsters, but otherwise the streets were deserted. When he finally arrived at the old supermarket where he had been shopping for so many years, he had to pause. The supermarket was a family business, not very large but always with enough selection to provide for himself and his loved ones. They seemed to have made a bit more effort with the decoration this time, perhaps to compensate for the austerity of his own house. He chuckled. He stepped to the door and rattled it, but nothing happened. John looked at the clock, realizing that it was now 10 p.m., astonished at how quickly time had passed. Checking whether the clock was really set correctly, his gaze fell on the state's clock tower, which also now showed a few minutes past 10. Slowly, John became nervous, but at that moment he saw it again, the figure that seemed to consist of shadows. He saw out of the corner of his eye how it emerged from behind the supermarket and approached him. At that moment, his nervousness turned to panic. He ran away as fast as he could, running down the streets. He even screamed, but no one seemed to hear him. He stopped in front of the house, looked at the clock again. It was now 11 p.m. "What the hell?" he said. At that moment, I placed my hand on his shoulder. I was the dark, terrifying shadow figure. John startled, turned around, and immediately stumbled back. He fell into the wet grass. I looked at him calmly. He was more than frightened. Perhaps I should have intervened earlier than now. "What do you want from me?" John whimpered. He felt sorry for me. "Calm down," I tried to tell him with my deep voice. "Everything will be all right, John." Even greater astonishment spread across his face. Where do you know my name from?" "I not only know your name, I know everything about you, probably more than you do yourself." "What do you mean by that? What do you want from me? And above all, who are you?" I lowered my gaze as I stretched my skull, hidden under a shadow-like hood, back toward his face. He looked piercingly into my empty eye sockets. "I mean that you are dead. You died 5 years ago today in a car accident. You left your wife alone in this big house, and you've been in the afterlife. But every year on Halloween, the day that, ironically, is also your death anniversary, your restless soul returns here to Earth and wanders around this town. You don't know that you're dead. The transition from the afterlife to the human world has the annoying side effect of erasing memories. I have the function of looking after you. Sooner or later, you will learn the truth, and I think it's better if I'm there immediately to, well, let's say, bring someone back." His face turned greenish as he stood up and approached me. He probably wanted to vomit right away, but he stayed strong. "Someone to bring me back, you mean? Then you are the death?" "Yes. I bear that name in this world." He looked at me for a few moments, then a bright glow formed on his face. His memories returned. "Good to see you, old buddy," he replied with a smile. "I hope I didn't cause you too much trouble." I shrugged. "Don't worry about it. Are you ready to go?" A bell rang. For us dead, time sometimes passes faster than for the living. The dimensions sometimes shift in a strange way that leads to these phenomena. With a final look at his old house, he nodded to me. "Let's go," he said and held out his hand to me. I took it. Light immediately enveloped us, swallowed us, and with the last bell strike at exactly midnight, the ghost and I disappeared from the small town. You are now wondering why I'm telling you this. Well, as you know, Halloween is coming up again, and on Halloween many ghosts roam around, not just those who died on that day. Of course, there are also other people like me who protect them. All I want to tell you is, behave yourselves. Who knows, maybe the ghost of your deceased relative is watching you as you, God knows, do something. But don't worry. They will still love you no matter what you do. They are still humans, even if they are dead, and loving is simply in human nature. What else is left for me to say except Happy Halloween? As far as I know, most people in Africa don't know Halloween. I once explained to an ex-girlfriend that it's a season when people celebrate ghosts, and she almost slapped me because she thought I was mocking her. In retrospect, I didn't explain the spooky holiday correctly. In any case, most of my friends, family members, relatives, and acquaintances know nothing about Halloween. I come from a country in southern Africa, and I must honestly say that Halloween isn't a big deal here. I won't reveal my name or that of my country because some of the things in this story are illegal, and I have no desire to end up in jail again. I know Halloween only through the many European and American horror films that I occasionally watch. Additionally, I'm an avid visitor of websites like Reddit and various creepypasta forums. Despite my great interest in horror, I was never really a big fan of Halloween itself. But that changed last year when I moved back in with my parents due to certain circumstances. Let me first explain how it came about that this 35-year-old man moved back in with his parents. I was never permanently employed. I had several businesses in the city with which I made my living. I was what most people would call a fraudster, swindler, or con artist. Before you judge me, you should know that this wasn't my dream job when I was a child. The economy of my country isn't particularly good, and decent jobs are hard to come by. Anyway, one day a deal went wrong, and it cost me my house, my furniture, and my cars. As a result, I was forced to move back into my parents' house. I'm not married, and I have no children, as far as I know at least, so my parents didn't complain too much because they didn't have extra mouths to feed. One evening in early October last year, I was browsing the internet for some stories when I noticed that most of them revolved around Halloween. It dawned on me that we were close to Halloween. A light bulb went on in my head, and dollar signs appeared before my eyes. I had an idea. This idea would bring me a lot of money. I knew it. I needed to create a haunted house. I had the perfect house in mind. The house next door had been empty for several years. When I was growing up, different families moved into the house, but they never stayed longer than a year. I hadn't thought much about it and figured it was due to the rent or the bills. My parents live in a lush suburban area, and most people can't afford the costs of staying in this area. I knew that the real estate company that owned the house had security personnel guarding it. I knew one of the guards. His name was George. He was dark-skinned, spindly, had a bald head, and a thick mustache. Whenever I had the opportunity, I chatted with him for a few hours. He poured his heart out to me. He told me about his wife, his family, his job, his boss, and many other things that honestly didn't interest me. I wasn't sure if he considered me a friend, but I wanted to use this situation to assess this kind of relationship. I approached George with the proposal to use the house during his shift for a few hours as a haunted attraction. He initially hesitated, but as someone who had complained to me about his meager salary, he agreed after I convinced him that this could be an opportunity for him to earn some extra money. He vehemently warned me that he would have my head if he lost his job because of it. Since his job was usually as boring as watching paint dry, he also offered to help me run the haunted house, which was very convenient for me. I just needed one more person to help me, and John was that man. John was a stocky man who always wore the same short haircut since I met him in high school. I know I said he was stocky, but if you say that to his face, he might knock you down with a single punch. He prefers to be called big-boned. John is a big baby. He also lived with his parents but had a well-paid job as a baker in a local supermarket. He definitely earned enough money to support himself, but I suspect he still wanted his mother to wash his laundry and his father to check for monsters under his bed, which is why he still lived in his parents' house. Anyway, John was also in when it came to the haunted house, and he even made posters to advertise the house. He hung them all over the neighborhood. He also brought discarded cookies and muffins from the bakery, which he suggested we give to our customers after they had walked through the haunted house. I liked the idea because it picked up the Halloween concept of trick or treat very well, although we wanted to give our customers both tricks and treats. Moreover, it meant that we would charge the customers more money, so I gave the idea a double thumbs up. Next, I needed props to decorate the house. Since I was completely broke, I had to work with what was available to me. My mother had some bed sheets that I borrowed without her knowledge. My younger sister Ruth hoarded many dolls as a child, but as she reached puberty, she neglected all her toys. My father kept all these dolls in the garage. I also borrowed some of these dolls without telling anyone. Once I finally had my props and my team, I was confident that this haunted house project would be a success. When we first went to the house to set it up, I was shocked at the condition of the house. I had never entered our neighbor's house before, and every time I spoke with George, he stood outside the gate. The yard was overgrown with hip-high brown grass. The windows were covered in dust. The 7-foot-high perimeter wall was overgrown with green vines, and the wrought iron entrance gate was so rusty that you could get tetanus just by looking at it. The house was a typical suburban house, painted white and with a sloping blue roof. It had 3 bedrooms, 1 toilet, a kitchen, a living room, and a dining room. The little furniture it had was run down and either covered in dust or cobwebs. The place was already spooky and required only minimal effort on my part. George told us that the house had an electrical problem and there was no power. His boss had sworn to fix the problem, but they had still done nothing about it. We didn't mind because the lack of power was quite useful for our purposes. Our target audience was children, preferably under 13 years old, and since they weren't that hard to scare, we didn't go overboard with the decoration. The process of the haunted house was simple. As soon as our customers arrived, the entrance gate would appear to open by itself, but in reality, it was pulled open by George with a wire. He would hide deep in the thicket of the brown grass in the yard. The customers would be greeted by a small wooden table with a glass jar labeled admission fee, where they would pay their entrance fee. If they paid, George would play a recording of laughing witches from his phone and a Bluetooth speaker. If they didn't pay, George would play a recording of barking dogs. John and I would be in the house. If we heard the laughter of the witches from George's phone, then we would go to our positions. If we heard the barking of dogs, it meant that the arriving customers had not yet paid, so we would lock the front doors. We didn't plan to entertain broke kids. This was a business, albeit an illegal one. After paying, the customers would follow the concrete paving stones leading to the front door. The paving stones were smeared with ketchup, which I had also borrowed from home without telling anyone. My mother became suspicious about why the ketchup was used up so quickly, and since my father loved the stuff, she blamed him. I, on the other hand, kept my mouth shut. The walkway was lined with tall brown grass in which we stuck doll heads on sticks. The customers walked down the sidewalk and entered through the front door into a spacious living room where dead lizards dangled from strings from the ceiling. George had gotten us the dead lizards. I have no idea why he had them or where he got them from, and frankly, I didn't want to know. The loud crying of a baby then caught the customers' attention, and they followed the crying to a closet in one of the rooms. Before they reached the closet, a doll with a butcher knife came out to chase the customers out of the room. John would then be in the closet, playing a recording of a crying baby from a phone. He was also the one pulling the strings so that the dolls could walk and make threatening gestures with their arms. This doll was even creepy to look at. I have no idea why my sister kept this thing as a child. With its shiny porcelain skin, the mischievous smile on its scarred face, and its long, tousled orange hair, it looked like an understudy for Chucky. The customers then entered the main bedroom where I would be. We called this room the White Room. The furniture in the room consisted only of a small rickety table, a wooden rocking chair, and a large built-in bookshelf. All these furnishings would be covered with white bed sheets. I too was wrapped in a white bed sheet and stood next to the bookshelf, waiting for the customers. The bed sheet I often used was long enough to cover my entire body, including my feet. I was always worried that I would trip over myself one day and not only fall but also embarrass myself in front of the customers. Fortunately, that never happened. When the customers entered my room, I was supposed to run toward them and chase them out of the house. As soon as they reached the gate, they would find that the glass with the entrance fee was gone and instead, there was a plate with a muffin or a cookie on it. Not a bad haunted house for people on a budget of $0. In the first week, business boomed. John really marketed our haunted house well. His posters were very enticing. I had warned him to advertise only in our neighborhood. We didn't want the owners of the house to find out and have us arrested. Then he even spread the rumor that the old inhabitants of the house were Satanists who sacrificed children for wealth and fame. The news spread like wildfire and brought us quite a few customers. Since our suburban area was extremely boring, people jumped at anything that could entertain them. At first, mainly young children were our biggest customers, but over time, teenagers and adults also became interested in our haunted house. George's shift usually started in the late afternoon, and John had time off at noon, so we opened the haunted house at 4 p.m. and closed it around 7 p.m. For 2 amazing weeks, we earned our money, which we divided by 3. I had the best time of my life, and I thought about milking this cow until it was dry. I wanted to run this business until the end of the year, but one fateful night forced us to give up this dream job, which we didn't even know we wanted to do, prematurely. It was 2 days before Halloween, and it was almost closing time. It was already dark, and we had agreed to do one more performance before we closed. I heard the giggling of girls in the hallway and a man's voice saying, "Oh, that's spooky." The sarcasm in his deep voice was all too clear. The group of customers continued to cackle as they made their way to my room. I heard one of them complain that this was pure waste of money. They reached my room and stopped at the door. The bed sheet that enveloped me was made of pure silk, so I could see through it. The shimmer of the moonlight that fell through the bare windows was enough for me to confirm what I had already suspected. It was a group of teenagers. Teenagers were problematic for many reasons. Most of the time they didn't want to pay, they were hardly scared of our setup, and some of them thought it was best to tag the walls, steal something, or destroy the house before they left. This group consisted of 2 girls and a guy. One of the girls had dark skin, short hair, and hazelnut brown eyes. The other had 2 long black braids tied into a ponytail, light skin, and dark brown eyes. They both wore white jean shorts and a pink and red tank top, respectively. The guy accompanying them was a well-built boy with thick black afro hair. He wore thin blue jeans and a gray t-shirt. "What's going on here?" the guy asked as the trio entered the room. The girls giggled as they pressed close to each other. "This is really innovative, buddy. We can see under the bed sheets," said the guy. I was sad because I was so easy to recognize, but then I noticed that the teenager was speaking again without looking at me. He was looking in the opposite direction from where I was standing, and indeed all 3 were looking in that direction. I followed their gaze, and my heart stopped. A few meters to my right, someone was sitting on the rocking chair in the room. The figure had a white bed sheet that covered its humanoid body. I thought hard about who it could be. I considered the possibility that George or John had come to play a prank on me. The figure slowly rose from the rocking chair, and the sound of cracking bones echoed under the bed sheets. The humanoid figure was of an unusual height. It was about 7 feet tall and as slender as a reed. Shoes peeked out from under the bed sheets, angled sideways like Charlie Chaplin used to do, and just like with Charlie Chaplin, his shoe size was ridiculously long. The shiny black leather shoes of the figure looked like the shoes of a cartoon clown. Suddenly, the figure marched toward the teenagers. With each step it took, its Bugs Bunny-sized shoes slammed onto the parquet floor with full force. The teenage girls clung to each other and shuffled behind the boy. "Bro, we get it. Okay? You're a ghost, you've scared the girls, but now you have to stop," said the teenage boy like a bouncer approaching someone causing trouble in a club. The stride of the figure had something malicious about it. Its huge steps rapidly reduced the distance between it and the teenagers. "Okay, that's close enough. Okay? Don't come any closer, or I'll have to hit you." But the figure was already over them. The teenager punched the bed sheet, and it fluttered to the ground so that no one could be seen underneath anymore. The leather shoes had also suddenly disappeared. My knees wobbled, and a wave of discomfort surged through my skinny body as I stared at the bed sheet lying on the floor. The faces of the teenagers were all pale with fear. The vanity of the girls had disappeared, and the boys' bravado had evaporated. They screamed so loudly that they didn't notice that I was screaming along with them. I began to run toward the door, and the teenagers probably thought I was another apparition chasing them. They fled the room in a flash, running down the hallway and disappearing through the front door before I left the white room. I was foolish enough to turn around, and my heart pounded in my throat when I saw it. The bony humanoid figure straightened up under the bed sheet. It stood again at an abnormal height, and its inhumanly long shoes reappeared. I tore off my bed sheet and ran like the wind. I ran down the hallway and stormed through the front door. I screamed for help from John or George, and I think I even called for my mother. George stopped me before I ran out of the gate and asked me what was wrong. I was too petrified to answer, so I just pointed to the house. John came out of the house and asked the same question as George. After I had taken a few deep breaths and tried to explain, a sound from the house interrupted us. It was the sound of a crying baby. "Did you leave your phone in the house?" I asked John. His answer shook me deeply. "No, I have it with me." The sound of the crying baby got louder. Soon it seemed as if there was a crying baby in every room of the house. "What's going on?" George asked anxiously, but no one answered him because we all had noticed that a figure covered with white bed sheets was standing next to the front door. Its elongated shoes now floated in the air as the figure hovered a few inches above the ground. The sounds of the crying children reached an ear-splitting volume. Some of the screams seemed to come from the doll heads on sticks in the yard. My stomach turned as I saw worms crawling out of the mouths and ears of the doll heads. The figure at the door stretched out its arms like Jesus on the cross, and one by one, the lights in every room of the house came on. My mouth dropped open as I saw the dead lizards hanging in every room of the house. I can't remember ever having hung up all these lizards. I heard George mutter. Finally, the figure lowered its arms, and all the lights went out simultaneously. The front door slammed shut in front of the figure, and the crying stopped. That night, George stayed at our house. I have forgotten the explanation I gave my parents, but I think it was more credible than the truth. Until now, I had never spoken to anyone except George and John about that night. I tried to convince both of them that it was some kind of prank, but even I couldn't believe that. George then quit his job as a night watchman for that house. Soon after, I moved out of my parents' house. I couldn't stand the sound of a crying baby that I kept hearing in the middle of the night from next door. My guess is that by celebrating Halloween, we might have invited or awakened something supernatural into the house. I know that sounds crazy, but my buddy Jeff, who is a paranormal investigator, recently contacted me and said that after his nationwide investigations, more people in the country are celebrating Halloween this year, and that this year, according to statistics, there have been the most ghost sightings in the history of this country. People say that if you walk past 7 black gates on Halloween night, you will see the 7 gates of hell. I thought it was just a myth until I tried it. I walked past 7 black gates in my neighborhood, and when I fell asleep, I dreamed of a raging fire. It stopped, and a large corpulent man appeared. His eyes were quite piercing, revealing his age, and his legs and hands were thin and looked like they could barely carry his weight. He spoke in a scratchy, dying tone. "Do not fear, child," he said as he opened the gate. My whole body went numb, and I was unable to resist as it moved by itself. The first gate. I saw fire and bodies mutilated, desecrated, and burned in horrific ways. They cried so loudly that I couldn't even hear the crackling of the fire. One came up to me with one eye and gunshot wounds all over his body. He said, "We are the desecrated dead who have not received a proper burial. We must stay here until the last judgment." I walked past him and to the second gate. It was located in a building. The second gate, I was in a dungeon. There were people chained up, screaming in pain. One was slowly cut in half, his body healing and then being cut again. A person was in an Iron Maiden, where the door was opened and closed, yet it never caused visible damage. A man with an executioner's mask said to me, "We are the torturers tormented by ourselves." I walked past him to the exit towards the third gate. The third gate, this time I found myself in a forest. It was quiet except for a few screams. A man hung from a noose. Another man plunged from a cliff, reappeared, and fell again. I began to run away from a terribly burned woman who was chasing me. I already knew what this was about. These were the people who had committed suicide. I ran through the fourth gate, which I found in a palace. In the fourth gate, I was in a palace surrounded by emperors, politicians, and really wealthy people. An emperor was being nibbled at by lions. As the lion tore off or slashed a limb, it grew back, and the injury healed. A politician was beaten by something that looked like a shadow in prisoner's clothing. A man in a suit came up to me and said, "We are the corrupt people. We used our power to help ourselves, not others." I went to the next gate, the fifth. The fifth gate was in another room. A man lay bound on a bed and was whipped by floating spiked leather whips. A woman was burned with a lighter, but her screams and cries were muffled by a cloth used as a gag. A rather large man came up to me and said, "We are the rapists and sex offenders who pay for our crimes on earth." I ran to the sixth gate. At the sixth gate, I was in yet another room. A man and a woman were stabbed. Their wounds healed almost instantly, like everyone else's. Another person was buried alive, and someone else was beaten and stabbed with a floating metal rod. I knew who these people were, murderers who were being treated the way they killed their victims. The exit led to the seventh gate, the last one. This nightmare is almost over. It's almost done, I told myself. At the seventh gate, I was outside. There was a man who wore a shroud over his head that was covered with explosives. He blew up, regenerated, and blew up again. Another was beaten, stabbed with sharp metal objects, and burned with torches, lighters, and matches. They were being held by people who looked like shadows. One of them came up to me and said, "We are the mass murderers, the terrorists, the suicide bombers. I am the shadow of one of their victims who overpowered them and takes revenge for killing me on Earth." I ran to the exit. When I woke up in the morning, I was terribly scared. The images of what I saw ran through my mind. In fact, that's all I could think about all year long. It was Halloween again, and I didn't dare go outside at night. I just went to bed. It took a while for me to fall asleep, and when I did, I stood before the first gate of hell. There stood a teenager like me staring at me. He was shocked to see me. My body went numb, and I couldn't control it anymore. I said to him in a scratchy, dying tone. I chuckled and opened the gate for him. After he entered with an expression on his face that looked like he was fighting and resisting something, I looked at myself in the reflection of a chalice filled with something that looked like blood. The reflection of the gatekeeper I had seen myself a year ago on Halloween grinned back at me. Always check your children's Halloween snacks. I mean, every time. I don't say this to spread fear. To be honest, I realized that most candies handed out on this holiday were probably bought at Walmart the day before and stuffed into a plastic pumpkin-shaped bowl. You're probably aware that most reasonable people won't poison candy or put glass in it or whatever urban legend warning you've heard. The only guy who ever did that did it to his own son. So don't treat your neighbors like criminals. They're just trying to give kids some innocent candy. This warning concerns a phenomenon that obviously has no origin. I mean that no one really knows where it comes from. I mean you can't buy such candies in any store, and if you search online, you'll fortunately get no results. Nevertheless, these candies keep appearing. One of these malicious candies is a cinnamon jawbreaker, also known as a door breaker. These are the candies you carry around for what feels like 30 days, your tongue completely torn up after the candy has more lint than actual sweetness, and in the end, you can expect a tasteless piece of gum. If your child receives such a candy, please check it. It could also be a red-colored gum or a red lollipop without a stick. I think you know where I'm going with this. The point is that it looks pretty generic, which makes it difficult to distinguish the real product from the dangerous one. The candies are sometimes distributed under the brand H.H. Sweets Company, a company that no longer exists, at least not as such, and has been registered with an authority since 1999. If you search the internet, you might find some H.H. Sweets companies, but I assure you that this is not the real business but merely a coincidence of the name. If the label bears the name H.H., It says underneath a slogan like, "Hot as hell but sweet as heaven." Not all candies carry this branding, but it's definitely helpful to recognize it. That's why I advise you, if you or your children hold an unmarked red candy, it's best to throw it away immediately. The phenomenon has only been documented since about 2008, but there's a possibility that it has existed much longer. Up to the time of this recording, 9 people have swallowed the candies, 4 of whom were children under 18 years old. Each case occurred on October 31st, with most cases happening in 2016, with a total of 3 victims. The only clues to the appearance and branding of the candies are the eyewitness accounts and the subsequent investigation of nearby opened candy wrappers. The victims' bodies are untouched except for the heads. However, with the heads, it gets strange. Each of the heads is completely burned, almost like a used matchstick. This would make identifying the victims difficult, apart from the fact that fingerprint analysis fits the nature of these deaths since the hands of the deceased were completely intact. None of the victims were related in any way, the only exception being a father and his 9-year-old daughter, Andy and Mary Kay Winfield from Lexington, Virginia. All others were not related to each other. Apart from the aforementioned candies, an eyewitness report from Brevard, North Carolina, documents the whole story behind the mysterious death of a 12-year-old boy, Shane Davis, who died on Halloween 2009. I was leaving the pharmacy around 8:30 p.m. when he, and by that I mean Davis, was running down the block in a zombie costume. At first, I didn't notice him because it was dark and the costume was also very dark. But then there was this orange flash of light, like someone lighting a candle. I turned around, and this heat wave hit me in the face, and the smell. Oh God, it smelled like cooked meat. His whole head was on fire. There were people screaming, but we couldn't do anything. He screamed for just a moment, and then he hit the asphalt. I'll just never be able to forget it. There were rumors that it was a curse from a witch or something. I'm not superstitious, but when you see something like that, you start to question things. Similar reports were documented for many of the other victims. Shortly after consuming the candies, the victim's head burst into flames, and shortly thereafter, the victims succumbed to their injuries and died. Since then, many rumors and theories about the deaths and the candies have emerged. Many refer to witches and spells, but some have found a large following beyond regional folklore. One of the most popular rumors suggests that the deaths are due to the execution of Henry Hipson Cassidy, H.H. Cassidy, in 1782, a candle maker from Ononcock, Virginia, the site of the first documented death in 2007. Cassidy, a local candle maker, was brought to trial for the disappearance of 2 young girls from the neighborhood. Although he had no motive for the abduction of the 2 young girls, at least none that was obvious, he was charged as a sufficient suspect because he had access to sweets to lure the children. After a local investigation where the body of one girl was found with candies in her pocket, Cassidy was charged with the murders and sentenced to death. The children of the town, who once loved the sweets of the confectioner, began to call Cassidy the Witch of Ononcock, making him one of the first male witches of legend. In a swift trial, Cassidy was found guilty and sentenced to death by molten metal, a procedure considered barbaric unless it involved an accused witch. Cassidy, who swore his innocence until his death, had a ball of molten metal shoved down his throat. It was a quick death, but certainly not painless. The townspeople believed that justice had been served that day, and the body was buried in a shallow grave. Since Andy and Mary Kay Winfield also came from Virginia, many speculated that the ghost of Cassidy returned to punish those responsible for his death and to torment the descendants of his accusers with his characteristic candies. The name H.H. Cassidy would also explain the name on the packaging, H.H. Sweets. Another popular theory is commonly referred to as the jack-o'-lantern story. It is based on an Irish myth and says that a man named Stingy Jack tricked the devil on several occasions, leading to his banishment from hell and heaven. Since he was a true swindler at heart, the man, forced to wander the earth, lit coal in a turnip and has since used it to illuminate his eternal path. This story, which clearly explains the Halloween tradition of carving faces into pumpkins, was also used to explain the candies. The stingy Jack, as he's called, seeks souls to join him in his eternal punishment. The candy, which burns the heads of its consumers, turns them into makeshift jack-o'-lanterns. This would explain the fiery demise of the victims and also the connection to the Halloween festival. There is a third theory. Instead of delving into mythology, some conclude that H.H. Sweets is exactly what it claims to be, a confectionery company. The motive for these crimes is largely still a mystery, but this theory excludes claims of ghosts and devils, and instead suggests that a few sick individuals had the willpower to conjure up candies with the intent to kill. Ultimately, however, no theory could be confirmed by conventional means. A candy that is, for lack of a better term, supernatural can only be explained by the supernatural itself, which makes it extremely difficult to verify the information about it. If you, dear listener, want to avoid the horrible consequences of the candy, then you should always check your children's Halloween sweets. Even better, avoid playing trick or treat altogether, or if you're too concerned, perhaps it's best to skip Halloween entirely. There comes a point in your life when the things that have happened to you just become stories. I don't mean that they're less important or that they didn't happen, but they just become something that happened at some point in your life and are less relevant, even if you survived them. 5 years ago, when we were 15, my best friend Andy and I decided to go trick-or-treating one more time. I know we were probably too old, and the adults in the neighborhood would roll their eyes when we showed up, but we thought they would hand out candies anyway because kids our age were more likely to vandalize their house if they didn't get free chocolate, and adults probably didn't want to take that risk. What the adults didn't know is that Andy and I weren't troublemakers at all, and we would never have vandalized strangers' houses. Nevertheless, we came up with the idea free sweets are still free sweets. Since we were both at that age when laziness becomes an art form, Andy and I just went out only to find that we got crappy stuff like caramel candies or what you find in Grandma's bean pot. If you know what to look for and have even basic social media skills, you can plan your route in advance. Even 4 years ago, kids were posting pictures all over Twitter and tagging where the really good candies were to be found. Today, it would probably be Instagram. We searched for #Fullsize. It sounded like a good idea at the time, but also led to more and more pictures of people who weren't wearing clothes below the waist. It wasn't a foolproof method to find the candies, but it worked at least a little better than the conventional method. We found a neighborhood not too far from Andy's house where there were 4 different stops with big chocolate bars. Each of us had 3 different masks, the cheap thin plastic masks that are attached to the head with an even cheaper and thinner rubber band. They cost only $1 each at the local supermarket, and we got more than that amount back in chocolate from just those few houses. Sure, after the 3rd time we swapped masks and rang the parents' doorbell again, they might have noticed something, but so what? By then, we would have been long gone to the mountains of sweets we could collect with it. That was the plan. But when we actually went out, only about an hour had passed before most houses turned off their lights and blew out the candles in their pumpkins. We went out a bit later than the other kids because we were older. That also meant, of course, that we couldn't be outside at the same time as the little kids. Andy scrolled through Twitter, trying to find out if there were any other houses nearby that we could visit, but he wasn't having much luck. I was scrolling through some pretty epic hauls when he nudged me with his elbow and held out his phone so I could see the screen. "Hey, there's another one," he said, his voice muffled behind his white skeleton mask. I looked at the screen and saw a picture of 3 full-size Snickers bars in a picture tagged with Fullsize. Andy scrolled his thumb over the screen and showed the address. It was about 2 miles away, which in our area meant it was in the middle of nowhere near the edge of the woods. "Bro, that's way out there, man. We won't get there before they go to bed." But Andy shook his head. "No, look," he said, scrolling with his thumb to all the people who had responded to that picture. No one wanted to go there, and everyone said it was too far away or too creepy or whatever. If they went to the trouble of getting full-size chocolate bars and hardly anyone showed up, then they'll surely wait for people to ring the bell. I bet there are some lonely people out there who just want to be remembered that they're still alive," said my buddy Andy. I really didn't want to go out that far, so I hesitated. It was getting cold outside, and I watched thick clouds of breath emerge from behind Andy's mask. 2 miles? I finally asked. He smiled at me with some of the harshest insults I'd ever heard. None of it convinced me until he pointed out that if we went there, they'd probably give us a bunch of candies without us even having to swap masks. Eventually, I agreed. At least it would make a good story. We could make it even better, maybe even live tweet it and see if people could spread it so we'd possibly go viral. We talked about that the whole way there. We'd make it look like we were in the middle of a horror movie. Us approaching the house, #creepy. There's some weird music playing inside, #WTF, the kind of things that would grab people's attention. Only we forgot most of that by the time we got there. The house was even further back in the woods than I thought. The beginning of the driveway seemed to be about half a mile from the road to the house, and there was a slight curve so that you couldn't really see the house or any light that burned in one of the windows. We didn't stop at the road or do anything else dramatic. We had already walked so far, and I think as much as we were excited about the Twitter thing, we were also tired and just wanted to get the candies and go home to watch horror movies. As long as the driveway it still felt like a quick walk. I didn't take my eyes off the door once I could see it. There was only a single light burning on the side of the house, and I think it was a garage light that shone from a side window, so you couldn't really see anything. There was a carved pumpkin with a flickering flame on the steps, but it was really poorly done, as if a small child or an old person with tremors had tried to make it. And there was a lock on the door. I mean, not a lock, but one of those little things with 5 buttons that you see on the doors of houses that are for sale. You see, old people have that there in case they lock themselves out or something, said Andy in a tone that didn't sound particularly confident, but it sounded good enough for me as I reached out to ring the doorbell. The ringing had barely stopped when the door swung open. We both stood there without exchanging a single word and stared at something we could only assume was a man standing in the doorway. He was about medium height, a bit overweight, but he wore this strange mask. He had squinting eyes, really thick cheeks, and a clenched mouth as if he were trying to hold his breath. Behind the man was a single red light bulb that backlit him. He just stood there, wheezing with each breath behind the mask, while slowly turning his head back and forth to look at each of us. I'm not sure which of us spoke first, but eventually, each of us remembered to say that one sentence. Trick or treat. The man stood there for at least another minute, looking back and forth between Andy's skull mask and my fox mask, before he turned around and went deeper into the house. Andy and I looked at each other. Even though I couldn't see his eyes, I can imagine they had the same confused look as mine. As we turned, I could see the man picking up a box of chocolate bars. As he slowly turned back toward the door, he bumped his arms against a railing and groaned as the box flew out of his hands and the chocolate bars fell to the floor. A few even slid up to a meter near the door. The man groaned and cursed as he bent down to pick them up. Andy and I didn't move from the spot until the man turned around. He was on his hands and knees picking up the chocolate bars, and Andy nudged me and pointed to the candy that had just landed in the doorway. I think I shook my head, but I don't really remember. A moment of panic overcame me. I just wanted to get out of there, so I reached into the doorway to grab the sweets. The man still had his back turned to me, and I knew I could have just grabbed a bar, and we could have run off. But it all happened within seconds. As my hand touched the smooth, cool wrapper of the chocolate bar, I felt a vice-like grip clamping down on my wrist so tightly I thought it would break. The man had turned instantly and grabbed me. He had been much closer than I realized. The light and my mask had made it so I couldn't see him very well. With a swift motion, he yanked me by the arm, and I flew against the door. As he pulled me past him, my body fell like a lump to the floor. He then lunged at Andy. Something flashed in his hands. Andy had turned to run away, but then suddenly fell to the ground. The man stood over him, still breathing insanely loud, his breath a cloud in front of his face. I was just trying to get up when he turned around, and I saw what he was holding. A taser. That's the last thing I remember before I woke up outside the house. My body ached, and my head was killing me. My face hurt, too. I realized I no longer had my mask on, and I desperately looked around for Andy, but I was all alone. The front door to the house was closed. The pumpkin had disappeared from the front steps. The lights were off. I rummaged for my phone, but that was gone too. I was about to start running when panic erupted inside me, and I realized that Andy might still be in the house. Yeah, he could have run off, but what if he didn't? As quietly as I could, I went around the house and tried to look into the darkened windows, but I couldn't see anything. I was clearly too scared to knock on the door. I mean, this whole thing wasn't a joke anymore. The guy had used a taser on Andy. As I had almost completed a full circle, I thought I saw something in the darkness. I pressed my eyes against the window and almost fainted as the fat round mask slammed against the window and hit the glass with its forehead. I let out a shrill scream, and it just stood there, staring at me. Then he looked down to the side next to him, and I saw something white being lifted up and becoming visible. It was a skull mask, Andy's skull mask, and there was something splattered on it, something red. I ran. I ran until my legs gave out and collapsed against the first house I found that still had lights on. I gasped and cried and begged them to call the police. When the police arrived at the house, there was nothing there, no man, no cell phone. All they found was the shattered door frame where the back door had been kicked in. In the darkness, I hadn't noticed it. Had I noticed it, then maybe I could have done something instead of running away like a coward. I later learned that the lock on the door was there because the house had been foreclosed a week earlier. The Twitter account that Andy and I had found was also a week old. Had we bothered to check, we would have seen that the account followed over 1,000 people and had just 15 followers. All tweets were retweets from other legitimate accounts, except for the picture with the chocolate bars. It was registered to the name of a kid who went to a nearby middle school, but that was just a lie to distract people and lure someone in, and it had worked. Why did he only take Andy? I had lost my friend. He was probably no longer alive, and all for a giant chocolate bar. It's hard to believe that a year has passed since the incident. I lay on my bed, trying to suppress the memory of that horrible night, but no matter how hard I try, I can't forget the events of that night. Halloween again, I said quietly to myself. I got up from my bed and went to the kitchen. Due to the special circumstances, I didn't go to school today. I ate my breakfast and didn't talk to my family. My family just stared at me the whole time. Today is such a beautiful day. Perfect weather, said my mother. I just looked at her and left the kitchen. I went back to my room, sat at my desk, and stared at the clock. There was only silence. I miss my friends, and not a day goes by that I don't think about them. The police never found a trace of them that night, and obviously they didn't believe a single word I said. Typical cops, I thought in my head, and I was slightly annoyed. The note I received that night I kept in a box in my closet. Should I? I asked myself. I went to my closet, pulled out the box, and placed it on my desk. Well, it's time, I said to myself. I opened the box and found that the sticky note was no longer there. No, that can't be, I panicked. I searched my room from top to bottom to find the note, but without success. With nothing else left to do, I stormed out of my room and back into the kitchen. Where is the note? What note do you mean, honey? Replied my mother. The note that was in that damn box. I yelled in anger and despair. We don't know what you're talking about, okay? We don't know anything about your stupid note, said my sister. You liar, I screamed back. Bro, chill. Calm down, David, said my older brother. Damn it, I need that note. I stormed out of the living room and went into the garage. I grabbed my bike and rode out onto the street. I don't know what I was trying to accomplish, but I had to get away from that place. I pedaled along the streets and through traffic until I reached the cemetery. I parked my bike on the grass and walked along the numerous rows of graves. I reached my friends' graves, then stood there silently, reminiscing about the good times with my fallen friends. A tear rolled down my cheek. It's scary how life can take away the things and people you loved in a matter of seconds. My friends aren't dead. They're trapped by that monster. I have lived in fear for a whole year. I have done everything I could to keep him away. Rituals, sacrifices, spells, just everything. I just hope that it's all over and I can move on with my life. I was about to leave when I noticed something on one of the tombstones. A note. I bent down and picked up the note. It read, "I haven't forgotten you." I was startled and utterly confused. How the hell did this note get here? I dropped the note and began to sprint toward my bike. Before I reached it, a tall black figure appeared in front of me. "Why the hurry? We're just getting started," he said. Then everything went black. I woke up tied to a chair in a large concrete chamber, with only one light burning from the ceiling and a metal door. The metal door opened, and the hooded man came in. "I told you I wouldn't forget you," remarked the hooded man. I felt too weak to speak. All my energy had been sucked out of me. I just stared at him. "Your protection, you don't have it anymore. I'm gonna have a lot of fun with you tonight. Let's get started right away." He brought in a cart with various torture instruments. He took out a sharp knife and rammed it into my chest cavity. I screamed at the top of my lungs as blood flowed from my body. "Shut up! Shut the hell up!" he said aggressively as he grabbed my tongue and cut it off with the knife. I felt the blood flowing from my mouth. I tried to get away until he tore open my upper body and violently stabbed into my organs. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused me? A simple damn human able to evade my grasp." He raged as he began to tear apart my organs. He grabbed my intestines and began to strangle me with them. I gasped for air, and everything began to fade. He let go of me and went to the cart. He took a blunt metal saw from it and began to sever my limbs. I felt the saw cutting through my muscles. I screamed and struggled, hoping that someone or something would save me, but I guess my luck had run out. The hooded man grabbed my arm and tore it from my body. I closed my eyes. I woke up again in the chair. My body was back to normal. I heard a laugh from the dark corner. "We're just getting started," the hooded man grinned. The metal door opened, and I saw my family enter the room. They had no expression on their faces. "No, this can't be. You should have seen the expression in their eyes." He laughed as my family vanished. My worst fears became reality. Every nightmare, every fear, and every doubt. The last year, I lived in mortal fear for my family and my own life. I wondered when he would strike. In the end, it happened anyway. My fate was doomed from the beginning. He tortured me for hours, using every means and method. I could do nothing but sit there. After a few hours, he stopped and said, "Now it's time for you to become my puppet, you plague." He stuck his whole hand into my chest. I felt my insides being ripped out of me, my soul torn to shreds. But no, I wouldn't give up. I began to resist with all my might. "He won't take me." "What? No, that can't be. This is impossible," he said, shocked as his soul was torn from his body. I now controlled him. I felt the power of thousands of souls flowing through my veins. I could now free all the souls of the innocent people who had fallen victim to the hooded man, or I could become stronger myself. It was Halloween night, and I had made my decision. It's time to collect souls. The pumpkins sang. The flickering lanterns bathed the streets of Tyatum in a dim light, but with the illumination of the bonfire within, the inhabitants could do without lamps. Princesses and fairies flitted about, baskets in hand. Shining superheroes chatted idly with creepy clowns holding balloons, and skeletons warmed their bones by the cozy warmth. All danced to the song of the night, and the smoke curled up to the full moon like greedy claws reaching for a pearl. Pirates and demons worked hand in hand to keep the fire blazing. Bats and black cats frolicked at the edge while jack-o'-lanterns smiled in barely containable excitement. Little werewolves galloped eagerly through the fields, squeaking and devouring sweets from their bursting bags. In the hollow of Tyatum, there was jubilation and hustle. The town celebrated in harmony. At the edge of the festival, A young witch felt a tug on her cloak. She peeked out from under the wide brim of her hat and directed her attention to a little ghost at her side. "Do you know where my mom is?" it asked in a small, fearful voice. Immediately, the witch felt pity for the poor thing. It was entirely dressed in white, draped down to the ground, and two tear-streaked eyes looked back at her. "I haven't seen her, little one," she said, her long black fingernails gripping her broomstick for balance as she bent down to meet the creature's gaze more evenly. "But I'd love to help you look for her. What's your name, little one? And where did you last see your mommy?" "At the Jensen's house." The ghost sniffled and shifted nervously. "And I'm Liam." The witch paused. She didn't know any of those names. "I'm sorry, dear. I don't know them," she said in a calm and friendly voice. "But come, let's look for her together." The ghost nodded, and the witch straightened up. She didn't offer her hand, as the little ghost didn't seem to have one. But then, suddenly, a long, thin, pale arm emerged from under the white veil and stretched out toward her. The witch screamed, and everything stopped. The music, now interrupted, came to a screeching halt. Heads turned in all directions, trying to find the source of the commotion. The bats squeaked and flapped their wings, and the fur of the cats bristled with excitement. The ghost began to cry, and the sheet slipped off its head, fluttering like a useless handkerchief to the ground. The crowd gasped. The werewolf children howled alarmingly. The jaws of the zombies dropped to the ground. The carved grins of the jack-o'-lanterns turned into small O's of surprise. All eyes were on the sobbing child and the witch who had recoiled in fright. After a few seconds of complete silence, the witch finally regained her composure. She let her broomstick fall to the ground, knelt beside the child, and took it in her arms. "Oh, I'm so sorry, my dear. We don't have many visitors like you," she murmured, stroking his hair as he whimpered and trembled. "It's all right. You just turned around, that's all." She pulled back from his small body and wrapped her black cloak around his blotchy red eyes. "Would you like to join our group until your mother picks you up, Liam?" The child stared hesitantly into the crowd. The inhabitants waited with bated breath. When he gave a small nod, the group cheered and released him. The werewolf children, eager to introduce themselves to a new friend, stormed forward to show him their games. The witch smiled as she saw his sad eyes brighten, and he forgot his sheet as he was drawn into the fun. The festival continued, and the bonfire came back to life. The pumpkins resumed their songs. 6 months have passed since the cool September winds swept through the brittle grass of Well Eglin like fingers through an old woolen blanket. But autumn is not over yet. The same cold breeze, sharp and bitter like a dagger at midnight, still cuts through the heaps of shriveled brown bodies that line the streets. And the deep blue hue of the sky has saturated to a shade none of us would have dared to comprehend. It was an eternal blue. Autumn began, as it often does, after a hot summer that ended in a thundering storm. Mama and I rocked on the veranda. We had spent the days picking fresh apples from our small but keen orchard when the scent of approaching rain began to be noticeable, and the song of the cicadas quickly fell silent like a spinning record without a needle. We watched and waited until the patter on the tin roof intensified, and then the pounding of the heavy drops drowned out the sky in a shadow, and the rest of the water came down. It was a heavy rain, heavier than any other in any summer. But from where we sat, Mama and I were dry as fish. The cattle weren't so lucky, though, and while the pigs could wallow in the fresh mud, all the other animals huddled in the night just as we did. Some of the chickens in their coop and the dog on the yard. Old Betsy had found her way under Mama's chair after I had spoiled her with the rest of my half-chewed honey ribs and remained in that position until we called it a day. So ended the last day of summer. When we woke up the next morning to a fresh September morning, neither Mama nor I expected the harsh transition to the autumn equinox that awaited us outside. The sky was now a bright, cheerful blue. Every raindrop lay 6 feet under the dew-covered, browning grass, and the trees shone in the same yellow as the sunlight, with a hint of red like gala apples. We strolled down the steps and into the yard, taking Betsy with us. There was no trace of moisture to be found in the air. The air was fresh, almost as crisp as the foliage under our boots, and as cool and brisk as we had hoped after the end of the dog days. The dog and the other animals behaved the same. Old Betsy romped around, the cows grazed the little green grass that was left, and the chickens were out of their coop. The mud had dried up, but that didn't stop the pigs from playing. On our land and throughout Well Eglin, the leaves of maples and ashes were scattered, which crunched underfoot as we strolled around. The children stepped into the empty housing blocks and rode them as passengers on their spokes to school. Despite the breeze that stung like a bumblebee, there was a certain warmth over our small town. As soon as I wrapped myself in the gifted jacket from Mama that had been hanging in the closet since Christmas, I could finally feel it too. So ended the first day of autumn. The sight that greeted us the next morning was downright confusing. I had mistakenly assumed I was drunk on rum when I first noticed the color coming through the blinds. A blue, almost violet hue that spread like a carpet through the room. I had jumped out of my slumber because I thought I had slept well past the morning dew, but the ever-ringing clock assured me it was only 4:45 a.m. A look out the window confirmed my suspicion. The sky was almost black, and the rising sun already seemed to be setting. The shrubs along the windowsill were also unsettling. They were almost copper-brown and covered with seeds. The whole landscape looked as if God had heavily loaded his brush with the idyllic colors of a red-brown dusk. Only the day had just begun. And as it had begun, so ended the second day of autumn. On the third day, as on all other days, the darkness of the night was broken by an unrelenting blue gaze that spread over our land and whose saturation increased day by day. It was as if someone had soaked a sponge in a bucket of paint, and day by day, the little bit of orange or yellow left by the sky rotted slowly into a dark blue. However, it's not just the sky that's decaying but also the trees, the grasses, and the remaining flora of summer. In their place, the tendrils of pumpkins grow rampant in the front yards and backyards, far beyond what God himself had intended. One of these pumpkins, a large pumpkin from the fields in Connecticut, had at this point covered the tire of my '68 Chevy as if it were the moon. Since then, it had consumed it. That afternoon, when the last warm breezes of summer met the howling winds of autumn's labor pains, there was a great storm that shook the house and the trees, causing many leaves to scatter onto the yard. The persistent gusts of cold air battered the windows and caused some of the pumpkins to roll down the hills like long bowling balls. The power surges they caused by torn power lines throughout Well Eglin rendered my CPAP breathing machine unusable, and I didn't dare sleep without it that night. So ended the third day of autumn. The next morning, I woke up with strained eyes. Even though the blinds were closed and the doors locked, the house was bathed in a bright blue, and the cold outside air was clearly noticeable. I checked the thermostat. It was almost 0 degrees Celsius. In a place like Well Eglin, it was only that cold around Christmas, never this early in the year. My wife had felt it too. She had woken up coughing with a cold, and I did my best to alleviate her symptoms with a boiling hot cup of coffee that I drizzled with honey from the comb. She thanked me and sat wrapped in a blanket by the foggy window until she called me over to draw my attention to the outstretched tendrils that had wandered down the lonely road to Well Eglin Square. The pumpkins were now the size of terracotta clay jugs, and the pumpkins were as wide as hay bales. The crooked, jagged guardian angels, the bare trees, bent over them, spreading their leaves far and wide, so far and wide that not even a blade of the browning grass saw the sun. And even the yellow that had just emerged raised its glaring head for seemingly only a few moments before it hid behind the horizon again and enveloped the land in pitch-black darkness. So ended the fourth short autumn day. The fifth day began like the fourth, with the pure brilliance of the cloudless autumn sky and the raspy coughing of the woman beside me. She had been gasping for air all night, and when we were both finally exhausted from the unrest, it seemed that the rest was only a mercy respite. When we both awoke from the brightness of the blinds, I had mistakenly assumed that her skin color was due to the strange color coming from outside. I was wrong. Her skin now had the hue of a duckling, as if she had jaundice. Her sunken eyes had the same deeper, rich color, almost orange. Her hair was falling out in clumps, and she had lost a tooth during the night. She clutched me with one hand, coughed into the other, and as it trembled, the speckled red along her yellowed fingers reached my eyes. Minutes later, I had called Dr. Sampson after bringing the poor mama a cold glass, which was almost frozen even though it had stood on the kitchen table the night before. Dr. Sampson answered abruptly, as if he had expected it, informing me of her symptoms before I had even said a word. It seemed my wife wasn't the only one in Well Eglin suffering from her illness. But just like with the others, there wasn't much to do except to let whatever it was take its course. For the rest of the day, she sat silently, apart from the whimpering of Betsy under her rocker, watching as the dirty deep blue, the air empty of any birds that had probably prematurely flown south, seeped into every corner of the sky above, and the orange-brown crept over the ground below. The only green to be seen were the few selected trees that, for whatever reason, never seemed to shed their leaves, the evergreens. This eternal green was, in a strange way, a comfort to both of us, even if the company of this color was only of short duration. It didn't take long before the creeping sunset, which occurred even earlier than the day before, turned all the colors of the earth and the deep blue sky above us into a molten shade of orange, like a print by Klee or Eve when the colors would run onto the ground. So ended the 5th day of autumn. On the morning of the 6th day, I heard a loud squealing from my slumber. I had immediately grabbed my wife's cold hand to make sure she was okay. It wasn't her. The screaming came instead from outside, from the windows through which saturated blue light seemed to seep into our farmhouse. I had taken my coat from the rack and stepped down the creaking veranda steps when my slipper slipped into a thick bundle of dried leaves. A pile of crackling orange and brown leaves whose colors were much deeper than my foot. I lifted my shoe from the depths, but as I surveyed the rest of the yard, it quickly became clear that there was no alternative footing. Our entire property was covered with fallen leaves, a layer at least 1 meter deep of rustling weeds. Then the squealing came again, this time louder and seemingly closer. I dashed in my pajamas and jacket through the brown hues until I reached the splintering fence behind which the chickens and their coop, the cattle and the pigs stood. None of these creatures moved anymore. Instead, the whimpering of the pig that had woken me came from a dense pile of leaves. I pushed them aside to see Clarabelle, our pot-bellied pig, emitting a gushing of blood and collapsing onto the dead grass beneath her. Mushrooms protruded from her skin, many fly agarics, and all around her, along the patch of earth, budding mushrooms could be seen peeking out between piles of leaves and the carcasses of the livestock that Grazier Carl had tended. Clarabelle had always been my wife's pig, and I had taken the bell she wore around her neck as I trudged back to our house. I held it reverently in my trembling hands, pondering how to break the news to my wife that all the livestock, including her cherished pig, were now dead. But inside, she sat at the table, steam rising from a boiling cup in her grasp. She turned to me with a faded, cracked smile, and I froze in my thoughts. My wife was orange, and the thin skin surrounding her watery, sunken eyes was a sickly brown. They were the same saturated hues as the leaves fluttering over the lawn. With another tired cough, she sank back into the seat and shook her head with a soft no. I took her cold hands into mine, still holding her bell. She took a deep breath, which became harder for her the further she fell, and looked up at me, crying as her lips audibly cracked. I began to weep as she collapsed inward, and so ended the 6th day of this autumn. I found no rest the entire night. I just sat in bed and watched as the darkness outside lightened into blue. At the same time, I noticed the hideous smell that invaded my nostrils, which perhaps awakened the rigidity that had gripped me. The air was already thin enough, but the expansion had seized me, and I gasped and broke into a coughing fit so severe that I almost vomited onto the floor. I reached for the CPR device next to the bed, pressed it to my lips as if it were a gas mask from the First World War, and panted and panted. For the first time in 4 days, I could breathe properly again. My wife, or rather the shell that my now dearly departed had left behind, was there in the chair in the kitchen. She had also liked tea, only the soft white fur of her coat now had the hue of time, while she whimpered to muted feet. The coffee cup still stood next to her on the table, frozen over because the temperature was getting colder and colder. I reached out to touch her. Her fingers bent at the slightest touch of my hand and crumbled onto the floor. I gagged into my mask and ran to the other side of the room, where the only comfort was the basket of apples that were supposed to have found their way into a mama's cake, but never did. They were all brown and teeming with worms. That afternoon, I had called Dr. Sampson again after I had covered all the doors and windows. Everywhere the blue light flickered through. It hurt now to stare at it for a long time, and the color alone dug into my jaw and made the drums in my ears ring. When the doctor finally answered, he sounded excited and frightened in the same breath. He begged me not to go outside, not to dare to smell it, and I asked him why, but he gave no coherent answer. He babbled about leaves and lungs, the mutual exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and that the earth was emptying itself. I then asked him why, since we were still breathing the little air we had, but he didn't know. I, however, knew the answer: we were the evergreens. But unfortunately for old Betty, she wasn't one yet. Before the day was over, the cinnamon-colored fur had completely fallen off like needles from a larch, leaving only the wrinkled skin of a now exposed dog. So ended the first week of autumn. Soon, from this week, however exhausting it seemed, weeks would become months. Halloween came and went, the scariest of all holidays, and then weeks turned into months. 6 terrible months as far as we could tell. Those of us who dared to go outside perhaps had no other choice, eyes covered and bodies wrapped in the warmth we had, and threw as many of their bodies as possible into the warming bonfires, now crackling day and night along the hills, to free us from the smell that kept many of us awake. Those who remained on the curbs, where children no longer walked or rode bicycles, simply sank into the earth and let the corn stalks and pumpkins continue to grow. Their scent was so strong that a breath of wind tasted like mama's cake and made me weep and laugh at the same time every time. Every autumn meal, day in and day out, the same pumpkin evokes the same reaction. Outside our windows, everything is frozen as in autumn. We often think together about whether the strange season of the valley continues beyond its borders, especially where it is not autumn. However, the clocks have lost the sense of their ticking, and therefore we cannot say with certainty whether we have even reached the winter months as we suspected. All we know is that the days are getting shorter and shorter. Some seem to last less than an hour, which used to be several days. Father Brick raved from the pulpit and frothed with rage about the end of days we were in. He swears that the harvest of death will be plentiful and that perhaps the colors of hell in shades of fire and sulfur have fallen to earth. It seems that even Dr. Sampson believes in his tirades. We pray daily that the warmth of a radiant spring will emerge in the once so lively town of Welliglin and end this endless autumn. I only fear that if an impending spring revives the fauna and flora lying in the wake of autumn and the cold of winter, this eternal autumn may spare us from whatever else may come with it. Leave a rating and follow my YouTube channel.